The last thing that Anne mentioned was this current project of mine, which is volume 2 of the new Penguin History of India, which I've been asked to author. And this talk this afternoon is something along the lines of thinking about the framework, the conceptual framework for this book. I've struggled a lot with trying to figure out how to write this book. It's a very difficult period of time, 1000 to 1800 or 1200 to 1800. There's different ways we can talk about the chronology here. But essentially, I want to kind of get into my topic by suggesting that we need to rethink not only how we conceptualize space in South Asia, but also time in South Asia. Both have been rather, in my view, disastrously distorted ever since really the British showed up in the 17th century. And what I want to mention here is that part of the problem is that we are still stuck with what I'm calling a tripartite version of history, of time, which is essentially a case of the British simply projecting onto India their own vision of ancient, medieval, modern. Now this, of course, idea goes all the way back to the Renaissance, and it's been updated, obviously, since the 15th century down to the present. But with that kind of tripartite vision of time, when the British East India Company comes to India, and they start writing the histories of India, they basically impose that same model of tripartite time onto India, so that we have, as you see here, this very important study by Elphinstone, dated to the mid-19th century, History of India, the Hindu and Mohammedan periods, suggesting now that there's a third period, which will be the British one. Now, this way of seeing time assumes that there were two great ruptures. 1026, when Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni sacked the temple of Somnath in Gujarat, seen today as a major intrusion of outsiders into the sacred realm of India, and kicking off, at least for the British, this Mohammedan period, a dramatic great rupture in time. And the other one being, of course, when the British themselves show up, demarcating the period from so-called Muslim rule or Mohammedan rule to British rule. And I think these ruptures are completely false for reasons I'm going to try to talk about this afternoon. It also defines these eras by who was the ruling class. Were they Hindus, were they Muslims, or were they us British? And that's another, I think, extremely distorted way of seeing history, especially an area as complicated as India. Most importantly, this model of time serves to demonize the Muslim period in order to justify the coming of the British. Much in the same way that medieval Europe was seen as a dark age. That term is still bandied about, I'm afraid to say, among Europeanists. After which, of course, comes the rebirth, the Renaissance. Kind of light, beams of light come into where there had been darkness. And this projection of European time onto India carries much of the same kind of prejudice. I want to read to you the opening lines in the prologue to a very important series of volumes edited by Henry Elliott and John Dowson. They translated a great number of Persian chronicles into English and presented them in the form of 8 volumes. Started coming out in 1849. And they really cherry-picked from all this huge body of Persian literature what they wanted. And the fact that they were cherry-picking is rather clear from what Eliot's own introduction. I just want to read a few lines from what he says. From these Muslim chronicles, we can gather that the common people must have been plunged into the lowest depths of wretchedness and despondency. The few glimpses we have, even among the short extracts of this short volume, of Hindus slain for disputing the Mohammedans, of general prohibitions against processions, worship, and ablutions, and of other intolerant measures, of idols mutilated, of temples razed, of forcible conversions and marriages, of proscriptions and confiscations, murders, massacres, and of the sensuality of drunkenness of the tyrants who enjoined them, show us that this picture is not overcharged. Then it goes on to say, they want to contrast, just in case you haven't got the message yet, Eliot goes on to contrast this previous Dark Age with the British themselves. The historians of the Delhi emperors have been noticed down to the period when new actors appear upon the stage, when a more stirring and eventful era of India's history commences, when the full light of European truth and discernment begins to shed its beams upon the obscurity of the past, and to relieve us from the necessity of appealing to the native chroniclers of the time, who are, for the most part, dull, prejudiced, ignorant, superficial. So much for the whole period of the book I'm trying to write about, right? Just wiped out in those paragraphs. So this tripartite division of time is extremely loaded, and I'm afraid to say that history of India is still being taught, generally speaking, in these three divisions. The volume that I'm charged to write, volume 2, the New Penguin History, is indeed the same period that Sir Henry Eliot was just talking about. Making my task all the more challenging, needless to say. Now, the other issue apart from time is how we conceptualize space. Most geographers and most atlases of India conceive of India as basically territory on which states imposed their rule. So we have political maps, probably 95% of the maps in the otherwise very good atlas by Schwartzberg, Joe Schwartzberg. 95% are political maps. The other way of seeing space is through the lens of religious communities, and that also has been done, but only done really in any meaningful sense after the censuses began to come out. Now, this is a 1931 census of India showing the distribution of Muslims. It's very important because in 1931 was the last really reliable census ever made. And you can vaguely see the outlines of what would become the two wings of Pakistan in 1947 on the basis of this demographic map. But the most insidious kind of way of perceiving space is by civilizational hegemony. And this takes us back to the tripartite division I spoke of a moment ago, the Hindu, Muslim, British. In our own times, we have Samuel Huntington to deal with his very influential book, 1996 book, The Clash of Civilizations, in which he literally conceives of the map of the planet in terms of what he thinks are civilizations. Although if you look carefully, you can see that he's very messy. He's including religions, mixed up with languages, mixed up with nation states, mixed up with semi-continents, but otherwise, no problem. Let's just look at the Asia part of this for a moment. You would never guess from this map that there are more Muslims in India, in South Asia, than all the Middle East combined. And the fact that the color is saffron only adds a certain bite to the argument, that being, of course, the color of the Hindu right-wing BJP party. And of course, the harshness of the lines. I mean, obviously, South Asia is homogenized in this one civilizational entity. Now, sometime before Huntington comes along, the great historian Marshall Hodgson, back in 1970, tried to correct for the kind of thing that would still be going on with Sam Huntington, namely to reconceive of space in terms of something other than civilizational terms. So he has this statement, remarkable statement, in Ijbis. By the 16th century, most of East Christian, Hindu, Theravada, Buddhist peoples found themselves more or less enclaved in an Islamicate world where Muslim standards of taste commonly made their way even into independent kingdoms, like Hindu Vijayanagara. So he's already loaded the dice about what Vijayanagara is all about, or Norman Sicily. Now, what's interesting to me is that, first of all, logically, this statement doesn't really get us very far, because he's basically defining the Islamic, what he calls, he made up this word, the Islamicate world as one that is characterized by Muslim standards of taste. So Islam, Islamicate, Muslim, they are all thrown into the same basket, and so I see we're making no headway at all with this. But his heart is in the right place, it seems to me, because he wants to get beyond this kind of simplistic Muslim, non-Muslim vision of the world, which is why he talks about Vijayanagara and Sicily. Now, if we look at these areas of the world, look at the architectural evidence. I think it's very, very telling. Here's Vijayanagara, this 16th, 17th century kingdom in South India. Over there is Sicily. But just taking Vijayanagara, what Hodgson has in mind are monuments such as these. We have arched and vaulted aisles. We don't know exactly the purpose of these buildings, but they were probably administrative buildings of the rulers of Vijayanagara. The notion of elephant stables, that's just for tourists to think about when they come. But the point is that we have very clear styles of architecture which do not seem to be indigenous to India, and that's really the point. But then, only probably 100 yards away from those so-called elephant stables, we can find this extraordinary structure, which we know now is the Mosque of Amir Khan, built in 1439. In fact, there's a Kannada inscription which tells us that it was built by Amir Khan. It describes it as a dharmasala, or a hall of worship, but because it did not have domes or arches, art historians refused to accept the possibility that this might actually be a mosque, even though it has a mihrab, even though it's facing Mecca, and even though it's built by this Amir Khan. In other words, the kind of power of architectural stereotypes were so deeply driven into people's minds that only recently have art historians finally come around to concluding, yes, well, maybe this really was a mosque. I'm showing these two monuments because it seems to me that they complicate any kind of simplistic division of Indian aesthetics, religion, space, or anything else into these categories of Hindu and Muslim. Furthermore, we know that this mosque was built to accommodate people that the Hindu Rajas of Vijayanagara employed as mercenaries, and they were Muslims, but they were never called Muslims. The term Musalman or something like that never appears in the original Kannada or Sanskrit sources dating to the 15th century. Rather, they are called Turushka. And Turushka is simply the Sanskritized form of Turk. So I think it's very significant that although Samuel Huntington may wish to carve everything up into civilizational terms, people living in the 15th century knew very well that these were Turks, or so-called Turks, which is an ethnic category, not Muslims. So the question I pose then, Hodgson is concerned about whether or not the peoples of India were enclaved into an Islamicate world. This kind of evidence would suggest that the Turushkas, if anything, were enclaved in an Indian world. Quite the opposite of what he was proposing. So we have this evidence of foreign styles of architecture which come into India, on the basis of which people have made rather extraordinary statements. But I want to suggest that this is only one. We can look at the contemporary paintings in texts such as the Tutiname, published in Malwa, or written and produced in Malwa in the mid-16th century, where at least the artist is imagining a temple which is domed and with an arched entrance. Nothing unusual about that at all, because it's part of the landscape. We can go to North India and look at the temple of Govinda Dev up in Vrindavan. Now this temple, from the outside, it's really kind of hard to tell what's going on. It was patronized by Raja Man Singh, who was a high-ranking Rajput officer in the Mughal Mansabdari system. And of course, being a Rajput, he had been patronizing Hindu culture all his career. But he's a Mansabdar for the Mughal Emperor Akbar. So we leave the outside and we go to the inside of this building, and suddenly we are confronted with a world that looks strangely out of place if you're following the kind of, Clash of Civilizations model of Huntington. We find vaulted, well, there are domes above it. We have squinches, we have pointed arches, we have intersecting vaults, and we're standing on it right now, a very large barrel vault. In fact, there's another one in the back of us. So what really is going on here that we can talk about? Furthermore, when we look at the patron of Raja Man Singh, which is Akbar himself, he builds this extraordinary capital, Fatehpur Sikri, and all the motifs of this capital building are triviate, which is to say they come out of the tradition of classical Indian architecture. Post and beam. No curves, no arches, no domes. Although the cupola might claim, well, that's a dome, isn't it, up there on the top? Well, actually, that comes from Rajput styles of palaces and forts that predated the coming of the Mughals, putting these little cupolas on top. And when the Rajputs were incorporated into the Mughal army and Mughal system, so were these dimensions of architecture. And if we go into the mosque that Akbar built at Fatehpur Sikri, we find the same kind of trabeated hallways, stone imitating wood, entirely post and beam, nothing remotely archaic about it at all. So what I'm suggesting then is we have these two examples, Vrindavan, which is a temple, and then we have this mosque in Fatehpur Sikri. And the architecture does not seem to conform to people's stereotypical understandings of what these monuments really are. And the same thing at Vijayanagara that I just talked about here. Things are further complicated if we look into the regions. If we go to Kerala and we look at this 15th century temple, the Madhur temple, we find really a concern with keeping the rain out. It rains a lot in Kerala. So this is a temple, and right down the street we find this mosque, the Mishgal Mosque in Calicut. And these two monuments, you can readily see, share a great deal in common. Neither one of them falls neatly into the kind of stereotypes of Hindu Muslim architecture that the art historians had talked about. If we go to Bengal, where we have another densely, high rainfall area. This is a bungalow. By the way, the word bungalow comes from the word Bangala, or the Bengal style, where you have this curved cornice that the rain come off. So the architecture of the monuments mimics that kind of natural environment. Here is a temple, 17th century temple in West Bengal, where you have a curved cornice. You have it's all made of brick, articulated facade with three arched entranceways and a dome. And then right down the road, we have this mosque, same thing, curved cornice, articulated facade, all of it red brick, and with a dome top as well. So in short, we have in Kerala this kind of phenomenon between these two structures. And in Bengal, this kind. The upper two are both temples, the bottom two are both mosques. Both of them, I think, kind of challenge people's stereotypes. More complicating matters is that the Raja, the kings of Vijayanagara, styled themselves Sultan, more specifically, Sultan of Indian kings, Hindu Raya Suratrana. And for many modern historians, one of them, the great German historian Hermann Kulke, he was really puzzled by this. I mean, how could these people call themselves Sultan if they're Hindus? Makes no sense. And he went through all kinds of contortions to rationalize what it might have been. Short of, so once again, kind of the ideology, the stereotype is overriding the evidence. What's really going on here, I want to suggest, is that the patrons who built these structures are essentially emulating what in their minds was a trans-regional style, which to them was seen as very prestigious, right? You want to get in on the action. This is an international, big world, and we're going to be part of it. Now, this is nothing new. Exhibit A, for me, is our own Supreme Court building, which clearly seems to be designed by people who imagined they were living somewhere near the Acropolis. Exhibit B, this gentleman, the first executive of a well-known North American country, who seems to be imagining that he is the incarnation of this gentleman. Now, there's something about bare-chested men wearing bath towels and hailing taxis that has become kind of normative for understanding of power. Now, it seems to me, and I have to, in all fairness, George Washington here, this is back in the 1920s and 30s, when 1820s and 30s, when there was a certain infatuation with the classical, obviously. But you don't have to go far away to see other examples of the kind of emulation that I'm talking about. My Exhibit C, I think you might all recognize this one. And just in case you didn't get the point that these people thought they were in Granada, it's the 1 block away is Granada Avenue. So this is not something that's unique to India. But it is something, though, that I think can provoke us to thinking about this word, which I'm going to introduce this morning. It's not, I didn't make this up. Shelley Pollack has the patent on this word, the copyright. But I think it's a very fruitful notion. The idea of a cosmopolis, which is, and I'm paraphrasing him and adding some of my own ideas, really consists of a network of texts that circulate through a very wide region, some of which are canonical. The texts are appearing in a trans-regional language, not a local vernacular. And it's a language of prestige. A cosmopolis has a special concern with establishing and maintaining moral and social order. Now, this can be etiquette, this can be comportment, it can be articulated in many ways, but this is the overriding interest. Very importantly, a cosmopolis is established not by force, but by emulation. And that is, I think, an extremely important point that comes back. We see this in the absence of any kind of capital city or bureaucracy, no fortified frontiers, no standing army. In short, this is not a state. This is something very different. And it's not based on a particular any religious system. And in this way can accommodate lots of people within it. Now, that's a very important point, because using the word or the idea of a cosmopolis, I think, can help us do an end run around the typical kind of knee-jerk way of conceiving so much of India's past, which is through the very restricted lens of religious community. And that's an important point I'm going to come back to. But these are some of the characteristics of the idea of a cosmopolis. And of course, by analogy, I think we all know something of what this might be. If we think about the Hellenistic world, which is to say the period from Alexander the Great down to Constantine, roughly 6.5 centuries, we have a world that is, again, defined not in terms of hard frontiers, no fortified frontiers or borders, but rather it's defined by points of cultural production, which is why I prefer this map, because there is no frontier. The Hellenistic world went as far as Greek texts went, as far as people were emulating the content and inculcating and absorbing the content of those texts. and which means we can go all the way to the west as far as Rome, where here we have, in the first century, Romans pretending that they're at Plato's academy in Athens. This is, of course, we're actually in Pompeii. But the point is, the Romans obviously looked to the Greeks with this kind of eye. And if we move on the other end of the Greek cosmopolis, which is to say as far as Afghanistan or even northern Pakistan, we find Buddhas appearing in this kind of mold. This is a standing Buddha of the Gandhara school. The Gandhara school refers to a particular type of what's called Indo-Greek architecture and well, culture, more broadly understood. And we can easily see or recognize elements of classic Greek statuary. I can't help but notice that once again we seem to be having here the same kind of bare-chested man with his bathrobe, and although this one is not hailing a taxi, but still the idea behind it, it seems to me, is very obvious. We're still living in a Hellenistic world, even though we might be inhabiting somewhere in the Punjab. Now, contrast that Buddha with this one, which was made only about 1,000 miles east of Gandhara, in eastern India, around in the present-day Bihar, only a couple centuries later. And it's a very different aesthetic that anyone can, at a glance, can quickly see. What we also see is if we compare this Buddha with those that were produced even 1,000 years later in Southeast Asia, we're clearly dealing here with a different cosmopolis, a different world. And this is the world that has been described at great length by my colleague Sheldon Pollock at Columbia, who has postulated that for about 1,000 years you have this world of circulating Sanskrit texts which informed elite peoples of all the way from Afghanistan through Vietnam and even beyond in what is now Indonesia. So Pollock describes the cosmopolis, or he describes Sanskrit as the language of the gods in the world of men. Very elegant way of saying it. And what he means by this, of course, is to emphasize the fact that Sanskrit is not a regional language. It is not a language which is confined to any one ethnic group. It's a language which floats above all these regional vernaculars down here, and which has extraordinary range across space. And this idea of a Sanskrit cosmopolis, I believe, can be applied also to a counterpart which would come along about 5 centuries after the inauguration of the Sanskrit. And that's really kind of the main point I want to make this afternoon, that it seems to me that one can apply Shelley Pollock's notion of a Sanskrit cosmopolis, fruitfully apply, to South Asia. Why? Because, and this is kind of the punchline of my whole talk, South Asia happens to be an area where these two cosmopolises overlap. And it's the overlapping of these two larger domains of culture that really characterize the complexity, but in a weird way also the integrity and continuity of the period 12th to 18th centuries. And I want to kind of expand on that point if I could. Here's our Hellenistic world, a polycentric world without borders. Now, holding that in mind, what one also can find is a Persian cosmopolis world, which again is a world without frontiers, characterized by places of production, cultural production, whatever that might be. It could be art, it could be sculpture, it could be obviously literary works, poetry, whatever. In the case of the Persian Cosmopolis, it got a kickstart in the 9th and 10th century in Central Asia, and more specifically with the Samanid kingdom, or sultanate, which goes from the 8th to the end of the 10th century. And what I mean by that is that the Samanids patronized what was then emerging right under their noses was a new language, what we call New Persian, appeared in this part of Central Asia, which was a synthesis, at least from a lexical standpoint, a synthesis of Arabic words and Middle Persian. And then now it's going to produce a New Persian. And to kind of, by analogy, suggest what I'm trying to talk about, most of you are familiar with the formation of the English language. The major rupture being 1066, when William of Normandy comes over, imposes French rule over the Anglo-Saxons, and then after several centuries, exactly 300 years in fact, you get Chaucer. Not that Chaucer himself invented the English language. Obviously there had been a synthesis between the Germanic and the Anglo-Saxon well before Chaucer. It's just that it is Chaucer and others as well that transform this from an oral to a literary tradition. And then you wait another 250 years and you get classical literature which we can read. Chaucer only with difficulty. My point simply being that almost exactly an analogous thing happens with modern Persian, where you have the Battle of Nehawand, where Arab armies destroyed the Sasanian armies and basically opened the door for the Arab conquest of the Iranian plateau, during which Middle Persian and Arabic kind of mixed together and eventually emerging in literary form, in very early literary form, in the work of Rudaki up in Bukhara, Central Asia. And then you wait another 250 years and you come to a whole range of classical poets. I'm just mentioning Nizami because I only had room for one on this slide. Nizami Ganjavi, the author of Half Pekar and the Khamsa, the five, right, Panchganj. Okay, so this kind of linguistic history is, and this is just simply to show that what happens in Persian is analogous to what happens in English, where you really enrich the language by combining new Arabic words with older Persian vocabulary. Okay, so this is patronized by the Samanid and Ghaznavid sultanates in the sense that both of these sultanates in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries used this new Persian language as a language of administration. Hadn't been done before. It's also the language used for high literature, political theory, and obviously as well poetry. So there's a real kind of renaissance happening at this point in time in Central Asia, not in Iran proper, but in Central Asia. It is carried east first by the Ghaznavids, and then by an upstart dynasty in west central Afghanistan, the Ghurids, who roll over the Ghaznavids moving east, take Lahore, and eventually establish themselves in Delhi toward the end of the 12th century. And in 1206, the beginning of the 13th century, the Delhi Sultanate is established. And only 15 years later, Genghis Khan himself shows up. And after that, you have more than a century of repeated Mongol invasions of Central Asia and the Iranian plateau, and attempts to take India itself. The point I'm mentioning this is simply to say that because of the disaster of the Mongol invasions of Central Asia, you have many, many thousands of Persianized Turks who are migrating into India, fleeing, traumatized refugees coming into North India. And the Delhi Sultanate has just got established just in time to accommodate all of this. So you have a huge influx of immigrants carrying with them the whole baggage of ideas and ideologies, and obviously as well as the Persian language, which was had just gone through this Renaissance period. So that by the 14th century, in a nutshell, Persian had become a prestige language for composing chronicles and other literary works. It had become a principal medium in state bureaucracies. It was being used now initially with the Samanids already, and then with the Ghaznavids, the Ghurids, and the 13th century the so-called Mamluk slave dynasties of North India are using Persia in the chancellery. It's also becoming a contact language for inter-regional diplomacy, by which I mean people speaking Uyghur or Turkish dialects or Chinese, Arabic, whatever it is, they would have in common the Persian language, such that when Marco Polo ventures off to China, the only language he learns is Persian. In the early 14th century. In the mid 14th century, Ibn Battuta, the great Arab traveler from Morocco, same thing. He learns Persian and uses it all the way to China, traveling much the same route. So it's a contact language, inter-region. In fact, it was the official foreign language of China. That was their window into the outside world. Persian had also become, by this time, a vehicle carrying core values of moral order and political order. And by that I mean to say that we have now a genre of literature appearing, the well-known Mirror of Princes genre, which really establishes a whole kind of worldview and ideology, a closed system. And you can see that we start with the world as a garden for the state to master, right? And we kind of go on through from state to law to king and so forth until you get to justice, which is that by which the rectitude of the world subsists. So, and I've actually seen some texts which elaborate this Mirror for Princes literature in the form of a circle. Linda Darling has actually written a book on this, with justice being the kind of the linchpin of the whole thing. And from the 13th to the 15th century, there's a huge production of this kind of Mirrors for Princes literature, advice literature, with much of the advice being attributed to people like Alexander the Great, who supposedly whispered these ideas into his own followers and somehow got preserved. One of my favorite examples of kind of a shortened version of this, right? The Cliff Notes version of the advice for kings is very simply reduced to this: no kingdom without an army, no army without wealth, no wealth without material prosperity, and no prosperity without justice. So justice, again, is the focal point of the whole thing. This ideal, which in my view is extremely important in terms of constituting the substance of, at least in a political sense, the Persian Cosmopolis. The coins that are minted in India, beginning in the early 13th century, just come out and say one word oftentimes. In this case, the great Sultan Iltutmish, who really established the Delhi Sultanate, the institutions of the Sultanate. Simply the word adl, or justice, appearing on his coins. Now what's interesting is these ideas are not confined to the political frontier of the Delhi Sultanate. If we go down to South India and look at some of these dynasties, the Yadavas, the Kakatiyas, the Hoysalas, at the Kakatiya court in roughly the same time, the early 13th century, we have Badena, a Telugu poet patronized by the Maharaja of the Kakatiyas, who comes up with this extraordinary formulation: to acquire wealth, make the people prosper. Make the people prosper, justice is the means. Oh, Kirti Narayana, they say that justice is the treasury of kings. So we don't need to be a rocket scientist to see the similarity between what Ibn Balkhi was saying in the 12th century and what Badena is saying way down in South India, beyond the political frontiers of the Delhi Sultanate. Clearly, ideas and ideology have jumped across political frontiers and are now informing Indian kings about what it is they need to do to be a proper king. This takes me back to the whole question of architecture, and I think provides us with a clue as to why the Rajas of Vijayanagara were building their palaces with squinches, domes, transverse arches, vaults, and all the rest of it. It seems to me that there is something going on here which is not at all dealing with Hinduism or Islam or Islamicate, whatever that is, but rather with something that is deserving of emulation and assimilation into one's own polity. So, to wind all this up, let me just try to make a few remarks about comparing and then contrasting these two worlds. They compare very closely in some respects. Neither one has any geographic frontier. Indeed, I think that's the kind of underlying characteristic of any cosmopolis. It goes as far as books will go, or as far as a text will travel, that is, ideas can go. We saw this already, this map. The literary canon is portable. And again, that really amplifies the first point. But also, and this is what's interesting, in both Sanskrit and Persian, what begins to happen is canonical texts get translated out of their trans-regional cosmopolitan language into vernaculars. And we begin to see this happening in the case of Sanskrit with both the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the two great epics of India, begin to get translated into Kannada, into Bengali, into Marathi. And what's interesting is the people patronizing the translation of these texts from Sanskrit to the vernacular are Muslim sultans. And that's another whole story. But my point is, it kind of challenges us to think about India in terms other than rigid divisions defined by religion. At the same time, canonical texts in Persian get translated out of Persian into vernacular languages of India. I just mentioned Nizami's Half-Pekar. That gets translated into Bengali, and then into Arakanese. It goes to Burma. The Thousand Questions, another Persian text, which is originated within South India, gets translated into Tamil, and from Tamil it gets translated into Malay, and so it goes into the Malay world all the way into Southeast Asia. So that's another kind of dynamic which is fascinating, that the idea of cosmopolitan can become vernacularized, but the canonical text is still canonical, and the reason it was canonical was because it began in its cosmopolitan language. The core values of a moral order and what I would call secular politics are also clearly visible in both the Sanskrit and the Persian cases. Now I know that we're not supposed to use the word secular until the French Enlightenment or something like this, 18th century, this is what we're always told. But what I see when I read things like the advice literature, the Mirrors for Princes literature, is some attempt to separate religion and state. Certainly the Mongol invasion of the early 13th century provoked a lot of rethinking among Persian theorists. I cite Nasiruddin Tusi, who had a very tough job. He's got to serve the Mongols. The Mongols are pagans. They're not pious Muslim. They eventually convert, of course, later on. But when he's living, they're still pagans, and they're ruling over a motley crowd of peoples who could be Jews, who could be Orthodox Christian, who could be they could be Muslims, they could be Zoroastrians, all kinds of linguistic communities. So Tusi formulates an ideology of advice literature, of behavior really, akhlaq, dealing with how you govern a multicultural empire, which is what the Mongols were. The point here being that Tusi's work then comes to India and informs the Mughals on how they are going to govern a multicultural, diverse India. So that a kind of a basket of ideas that had originally emerged in the context of the Mongol conquest of the Middle East now becomes instrumentalized in the case of Mughal rule of South Asia. And that's part of this whole idea of the cosmopolis, I would say. Now for Pollock, Sanskrit Cosmopolis, you can see here, for him it really boils down to a similar discourse, similar idioms, similar claims, but all having to do with polity, kingly virtue, dharma of rule, and universal dominion. So it's, in other words, it's very political. And I would suggest that the Persian counterpart to that is the whole genre of advice literature, the so-called Mirror for Princes, which is being produced at roughly the same time. But the really important point here, I think, is the issue of overlapping and how this happens. I've already discussed the architecture. This is not what I mean. This is an example of what I would call colonial architecture, in the sense that the architects of this famous tomb came straight from Shiraz. And you can look at this and almost imagine you're in Shiraz. Or I don't know, maybe that's an overstatement, but the point is that this is not an indigenous monument in the sense of being something that was built by Indian architects. Whereas this certainly was. The vaulted aisles, the arches, the domes, all of this were things that were clearly emulated. This is not a colonial project, it's something that was done from within India and is therefore very different. We see the same kind of thing happening in sculpture. Here is the courtyard of a very important town in central India, Raichur, which was conquered by one of the kings of Vijayanagara, Krishna Raya. And he, along the interior of the courtyard you see here, are a series of friezes. And these friezes are basically figures which tell the story of the Ramayana. So here we have Rama himself up in the top with his bow, as he's oftentimes depicted. And you see Ravana down there with the many arms further down the way. Directly across this panel in the courtyard is another panel depicting the king, Krishna Raya. And there's a direct homology between the two, which is reinforced in all kinds of other ways in this particular courtyard. But what I want to focus on is the attire of Krishna Raya. What he's wearing on his head, this headgear, is called kulai in Telugu. Now this is a loan word from the Persian kula, which is a normal word for any kind of headgear. But my point is that we find contemporary with Krishna Raya, Shah Ismail Safavi wearing a Taj Kula, or royal crown. And these kind of tall headgear was all the rage in early 16th century India. Why? Because it was associated with this larger Persianate world into which kings like Krishna Raya were trying to get. It goes the other way as well. We can see, for example, in mosques like this mosque in Bengal, Padma, what's the word I want? Lotus. And they're plastered all over the place, because the lotus is a symbol of fertility, of the triumph of beauty over muck. And we put a huge lotus right above the mimbar in this mosque. And we also see them plastered all over places like the mihrab itself, the most important element of any mosque. You have all of these lotuses. And so the kind of seepage of Indic visual elements into a specifically Islamic context is one more example, it seems to me, of this kind of cross flow. We see it in sculpture, we see it in epigraphs. Here's a great Sanskrit inscription from the early 14th century, issued by the Sultan, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. The substance of it deals with the repair of a temple that had been damaged as a result of some kind of local conflict. And the governor, the Muslim governor, is ordered by the Sultan to repair the temple. Why? Because this is how we maintain peace in the area. We don't want anyone wrecking temples, and your job is to go out there and fix it. Now this inscription is interesting for lots of reasons. First of all, the fact that it's not written in Persian. It's written in the language of the other Cosmopolis. And we also see on the left and right, above the top, there's the moon and there's the sun. This is a classic formula that you find in pre-Turkish Indian inscriptions. You know, this inscription will last as long as the sun and the moon are in the sky. It's a regular formula, stock formula. It's dated in the Shaka calendar, not the Hijri. The Sultan himself is described as the Maharaja Dhiraja, Sri Suratana, which is to say the exalted and mighty king of kings, analogous to the idea of the Shahanshah, in other words, the emperor, and the prosperous Sultan. In other words, he's using specifically Indic formulae to describe the Sultan. And the governor, Qiyamuddin Tughlaq, is called the Mahapradhana. So what we see here, it seems to me, is how the Sultan of Delhi is situating himself within the cultural universe of local Indian society, with all these uses of titles and in the epigraph itself. Back to Krishnaraya. Abdurrazak Samarkandi was an ambassador from the Timurid court who travels from Herat to South India. He goes to Vijayanagara, and he describes the trip there in 1443 in great detail. And what you see is, he looks around and everything he sees is completely familiar. He sees the palace of the Raja, and he calls it the Hazar Satun, the 1,000-pillar palace. He sees the Raja himself dressed up in garb, which he recognizes as exactly the same thing that we wear up in Central Asia, back in Herat. They discuss what's happening in Shiraz and Tabriz and other important cities in the Persian Cosmopolis. All of it, and these conversations are recorded so that we know that Samarkandi, in his own view anyway, sees Vijayanagara as part of this larger Persianate world. And then finally, I want to come to the question of language. And this is fascinating. More Persian dictionaries were produced in India than anywhere else in the world, far more, in fact. And after 1500, virtually all Persian dictionaries were produced in India. Probably because after Timur destroys Delhi, you have all these regional sultanates across India, and each one wants to be kind of the new Delhi, as it were. Which means to say they need to patronize Persian, and patronizing a Persian dictionary puts you on the map of the Persian Cosmopolis in a very direct way. But what's also happening in the 16th century is that Sanskrit canon are getting translated into Persian by the orders of the court. So now the two cosmopoli are having direct interaction. The Emperor Akbar, and then later on Jahangir, order the translation of the same Sanskrit canon, which had earlier been translated into vernacular languages, now are being translated directly into Persian. You do this because you want to be seen as the king of all peoples of South Asia. And by having these translations made, you are trying to accomplish that. But the other thing that's happening is very interesting, is that Persian is declared the official language to be used at every level of Mughal administration from 1582 forward. In other words, it's not just the capitals or the palaces. Now at the lowest possible district level, everyone has to learn Persian in order to get a job in the vast, sprawling Mughal bureaucracy. Persian was apparently chosen out of a desire to forge a political culture that would be that would arch over all the diverse communities of India. I go back to Tusi, Nasiruddin Tusi, and his work on akhlaq, inspired by the Mongols ultimately. And what this means is that lots of ordinary people have to learn Persian in order to get into government. And this is also seen in the production of another genre called nisab. Now, the dictionaries are one thing. We all know about them, right? Farhang. Nisabs are very, very different. These are kind of like Lonely Planet or Baedeker guides. They're intended for use by people who need to make a foreign language familiar to them. And we begin to see them already in the 13th, 14th century. All these immigrants that came down the corridor from Central Asia to North India were encountering a Hindavi world, language world. And so these nisabs are basically word books, rhyming word books, so that Persianized Turks can understand Hindavi words. But then interestingly enough, after 1550 roughly, the whole thing reverses, and now we find Indians creating these same kinds of word books for the purpose of making Persian familiar to them. It all has to do with directionality. Which direction are we moving? Each one of these nisabs assumes that the community is familiar with one language, but unfamiliar with another one. And the production of these books, and there's an interesting book, a colleague of mine is just now writing a book on this whole phenomenon of the nisab, as a vehicle for harmonizing communities that had been linguistically separated from each other. And what this really is telling us is that Persian is not at all an elite language or confined to the court. It's something which is now being used by thousands, indeed millions of people across the subcontinent, in the same way that English became a language of the masses. You had to know it to get into the British system in the 19th and 20th centuries. Persian had that same function. So I'll close then with a few comments about the contrasts between these two cosmopolises. First of all, Persian certainly was widely used as the language of bureaucracy. Both the revenue administration and the justice administration, these are all written in Persian. I mean, I myself have been to record rooms way out in the back of beyond in the remote jungles of Bengal, and you can just imagine these clerks who were using, obviously they were not native speakers, you could tell that, but they're using Persian because that is the language of communication in the districts. Not with Sanskrit. Sanskrit never was a language that was widely used for ordinary administration. It was used for political theory ad nauseum. All kinds of texts, normative texts describing about, kingship, all the things that Shelley Pollack describes, but not the actual administration. What that meant was that you had this huge kind of void. Sanskrit remains a language of political theory at the top, but then Persian invades from below and becomes the language of actual administration, which is why we have such enormous vocabulary of Persian in vernacular Marathi, Bengali, Telugu, Kashmiri, all of them. A second contrast is the base, the social base. Persian became a mass language, especially after as I say, it became a language of the administration. That was not the case with Sanskrit, which remained a language of Brahmins and Jains, and did not have this kind of reach. Indeed, non-Brahmins who used Sanskrit and wrote about religion were punished. Tukaram, famous Marathi poet, 17th century Maharashtra, was forced to take all of his books and sink them in the river by Brahmins because he had the audacity to write about religion in the language, and sacred language. So there's a clear difference in terms of the social base. And then finally, there's a difference in terms of their relative attitudes toward the cultural others. By the time Persian reaches India, it had already absorbed Greek, pre-Islamic Iran, Turkic, and even Indian culture itself was becoming assimilated. Alexander the Great was defined as a great Iranian. His mother was an Iranian princess. He's absorbed into Persian culture, at least according to Ferdowsi. Whereas when we come to the Persian side, the Sanskrit side, there's a real hostility toward assimilating other cultures. They're not really interested in Islamic or Persian philosophy. We don't get Sanskrit treatises systematically comparing, say, Indian thought with other cultures. So that's another contrast. I'll simply close then where I began, which is these two monuments, which seem to me to provoke one to rethink simplistic binary categories of Hindu and Muslim, and suggest that what we really have, if you need to use schematic designs at all, something like this might come closer to the mark, where we have an overlapping of two different textual traditions, which do not exclude religion. I have to say that not being based in religion is one thing, but that doesn't mean you exclude it. You cannot imagine Sufism in India without the enormous body of Persian works. So just as Sanskrit comments on Buddhism and Jainism and the various forms of Hindu thought, so also Persian comments extensively, obviously, enormous treatises on religion, and not just Islam. But the point I'm getting at is that the Cosmopolis idea seems to be larger than simply religion. Religions could be fit within or tucked within these literary traditions. And if we can think in terms of these traditions, these larger traditions, rather than the more narrow sense of religions, it seems to me we might have a better chance of making sense of the Indian past. Thank you very much.